Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Correctional System and Practice. Okay, so I came up with an idea. Your essay questions for the final exam. What impact does a high incarceration rate have on minority communities? What implications does this impact have for the effectiveness of the criminal justice system? Given that the death penalty has been abolished in other Western democracies, why do people in the United States still support it? What is your position on the death penalty? Why do you think that the community justice movement is so popular? Will it last or will it soon be over? Why? What if I assisted with a frame of reference, i.e. videos? I hope that these videos will assist you in formulating your essay.
Right now, while you're looking at this on your screen in your hand or on your computer, there's somebody just like you who's sitting in a prison cell. And they didn't do much more than you did, some crazy weekend. You didn't get caught. They got caught. And they can never get uncaught. The United States of America is now the #1 incarcerator of human beings in the world, in the history of the world. We have about 5% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's prisoners. We have more people locked up than China. China, who has 1 billion people, they got fewer prisoners than we do. A lot of times people say, well, if you don't want to do the time, don't do the crime. Really? Have you ever committed a crime? You got people who are doing more drugs on college campuses, in yacht clubs, country clubs. We all know that's going on, but the SWAT team never shows up there. The SWAT team shows up in the housing projects where you got poorer people doing fewer drugs, and those people go to prison. But think about it. What if one of the times when you were breaking the law, when you had something illegal in your pocket, in your car, at your party, the police had kicked in those doors? Would you want to be known for the rest of your life based on what happened that night? That is what is happening to millions of people. If rich folks' kids get in trouble, they go to rehab. Poor folks' kids get in trouble, they go to prison. And you spend $100,000 per year per kid to lock a kid up, when you could have spent a fraction of that and turned them into a NASA scientist, turned them into a fashion icon. When people come home from prison, they're not given the opportunity to start over. You leave a physical prison and you go into a social prison where you can't get a job, you can't get a student loan, you can't rent an apartment. How are people supposed to start over? And what happens to neighborhoods when you take a disproportionate number of people out for minor offenses and you send them back home with no hope and no opportunity? There are no more excuses to have this horrible system continue when there is now finally bipartisan agreement that it is a tragedy to do this. Not only do you have President Obama and the Democrats, you now actually have people like Paul Ryan, Koch Industries, Newt Gingrich, all saying the same thing. We are locking up too many people, we're wasting too much money, we're wasting too much genius in America, and it's time to do something.
Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the convicted bomber of the Boston Marathon, one of the focuses of the new discussion about reviving the federal death penalty. You met with him 5 times in 2015, and you testified on his behalf, saying, I presented him as a human being. Talk about what drives you to do this work. What is it like to meet these prisoners, to accompany them to their death?
Well, it's human rights that human beings can never be identified solely with their actions, that everybody's worth more than the worst thing they've ever done. So like at Djohar's trial, all prosecution wanted to do was demonize.
This is the Boston Marathon.
Yeah, the Boston Marathon. And he was the younger brother. All I said, all the words I could get before the jury were, he's a human being and he felt sorrow for what he did. And I showed why I could say that. And
why could you say that?
Because I had met him. And And I, at some point, and this came out in the testimony, I just said, George, you hate us all. Would you drop a bomb on all of us? And he lowered his eyes like this, and he just said, no, of course not. Nobody deserves to die like that. So you had to be so careful in the language. The prosecutor was holding me to just the language you could use, the judge and so forth. But it's with everybody I've accompanied to death. Some of them, most of them were guilty. 2 of them were innocent because it's so broken. And they have done despicable things, but the death penalty is about us. And more people are standing up now, including guards and wardens who have been close to the killing process. We haven't had an execution in Louisiana in 17 years. There's no official thing that has said we're not going to kill people. And that's going on across the country. A lot of times because the guards who've had to do the killing and the wardens don't want to do it anymore because it does nothing and they're so close. And that's been the heart of the conversation in the Catholic Church. And I said to Pope John Paul II, I said, does the Catholic Church only uphold the dignity of innocent life? Well, when I'm walking with a man to execution and he's shackled hand and foot and he's surrounded by 6 guards and they're going to walk him down this hall and strap him down and kill him. And he kind of turns to me and says, Sister, please pray God holds up my legs. Can you help the church uphold the dignity of all life? That to take a human being and render them defenseless and kill them can never be justified? And so Pope John Paul was the first one, and then Pope Francis finally moved it to completion and said, under no circumstances can we ever allow the state to kill. It's human rights that drives me because I get to meet the human beings.
More than half of victims of violent crime don't even call the police in the first place. They prefer nothing to everything we have to offer. The vast majority of crime survivors' pain goes unhealed. What the existence of restorative justice means is that we can no longer pretend we don't know what else to do. As a country, we're really good at punishment. It's passive. It doesn't require people to act, to think. It certainly doesn't require them to change. When we lock people up, we excuse them from their responsibility to answer for what they've done. Restorative justice is a process to hold them accountable. It's a tool. People take turns answering questions like what happened, what needs arise, whose responsibility is it to meet those needs, and how is that person going to do it? It requires someone to take responsibility, to repair things as much as possible, and to never commit that harm again. This isn't about feeling sorry, it's about doing sorry. Things like go to school, get a job, pay restitution, apologize, do community service. Restorative justice practices have been used to address low-level infractions like vandalism, up to addressing the impact of murders on the surviving family members. Restorative justice processes are first and foremost about meeting the needs of people who are hurt. Sometimes the person who can make the greatest contribution to a survivor's healing is the person who harmed them. To come through trauma, we need answers to our questions. To say, my life was never the same after you hurt me like that. Crime survivors want the most safety possibly available. So if incarceration actually produced safety, we would have the safest country in human history. That's not what we have. The core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, an inability to meet one's economic needs, and exposure to violence. And we bake those into prisons to try and keep people from committing further violence. Incarceration exposes people to exactly the things that increase the likelihood that they'll go on to harm others. People who are hurt deserve a process that will help them heal. People who are responsible for crime have an obligation to be accountable for that. All of us deserve responses to crime that actually make us safer. Our current criminal justice system doesn't deliver any of those, and restorative justice at its best delivers.
Hello, I'm King County Prosecuting Attorney Dan Satterberg. Welcome to another edition of the Prosecutor's Partners. This is a 3-part series called Criminal Justice, Community Justice. It explores some of the innovative things that we're doing here in King County to involve the community in helping to define accountability and justice. Criminal justice, community justice. You know, there's good news and there's bad news when it comes to the criminal justice system in America and in the state of Washington. The good news, crime is down to historic lows. We haven't been this safe in our communities since the mid-60s. The bad news is that incarceration rates are at all-time highs. In fact, if we were to go back to the incarceration rates of the 1960s, we would have to release 80% of the people who are in state, local, and federal prisons. Let's take a closer look. Mass incarceration is a term that sociologists use to describe the criminal justice policies of the United States over the last 40 years. Many of us are aware that the United States is the world's leader in incarceration, with 2.3 million prisoners. While we have 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's prisoners. We lead the world. We're ahead of Russia, Ukraine, Poland, many other countries, and all of the European countries. This is not a category that the United States wants to be number one in. How did we get here? It's important to know that it wasn't always this way. In fact, the incarceration rate in America from the 20s till the late 70s hovered around 100 people per 100,000 citizens. Then something happened. In the 80s, when we saw crack cocaine hit the cities, legislators and the Congress responded with a very punitive approach. And all of a sudden, within a few years, our incarceration rate went from 100 people per 100,000 citizens to more than 500. So what was behind this new policy to build and fill more prisons, both at the federal level and the state level? Well, there was a blip. There was a violent crime wave, and it peaked at about 1993. And you can see in the solid blue line on this chart that it peaked and then it started to fall. But the policies behind prison construction didn't fall when the crime wave fell. In fact, as you see that the golden chart line here, that prisons continued to be built and filled. Sentences were longer, more and more people were sent to prison. That was behind a 500% increase in the incarceration rate in the United States. Washington State followed suit. Our state in 1990 had barely 6,000 inmates, but 10 years later, 18,000. We tripled our prison population in 10 years. Like many states, we passed tough laws against drugs and longer sentences for violent crimes, and we built and filled prisons. Now, interestingly, in the next 16 years, the prison population barely grew, and that's simply because we didn't build any more prisons. We added a few beds here and there. Washington State ranks 41st out of the 50 states in our rate of incarceration. The only 8 states do less incarceration than we do. Yet, this is the tension in our story. If we don't do something to reduce the number of people who are coming to prison or how long they stay, we're going to have to build another prison in the state of Washington. We're going to be 1,400 beds short in 6 years if we don't plan to build a new prison, which, by the way, takes about 5 years to build once you've decided to do it. The next prison will cost $250 million in tax dollars and $80 million a year to run it. The question, how can we avoid spending that kind of money when we know that public education, mental health, drug treatment, and other pressing needs are competing for those dollars? Another motivating factor for criminal justice reform has to be to address the racial disproportionality that is so obviously a part of our criminal justice system. And here in Washington, where we incarcerate people at less than half the national average, we too have a racial disproportionality problem, where 4% of the state population are African Americans, 18% of the prison population are African Americans. And this statistic should bother everyone, that African American men are 6 times more likely to be in prison during their lifetime than white men. So prison construction is both unsustainable in terms of the finances, but it also continues to exacerbate the tensions and the mistrust between the criminal justice system and the communities that are most impacted by crime. We have to find a new approach. In many ways, it's going to be harder in Washington State than in other states that have over-incarcerated nonviolent crimes, because in Washington state, I think we've made pretty good decisions about who should go to prison. About 70% of the people sitting in prison today are there having been convicted of a violent offense. Only 19% are there for property crimes, and if you understand the state sentencing law, that means that they have a criminal history of at least 6 other felony crimes before a property crime earns them a prison sentence. And drug crimes account for only about 8% of the population of the Washington State Prison. So what are we going to do to avoid building that next prison? Well, I believe that Washington State has a recidivism problem. In fact, we know that today 1/3 of the people being released from prison this year will be back in prison in 3 years. Every year in Washington State, about 8,000 people are released having served their sentence. They are released very often with no support at all. In fact, the standard reentry program in the state of Washington Department of Corrections is to give an inmate $40, a clean set of clothes, a new identification card that says Department of Corrections on it, and a bus ticket back to the county where they were convicted, whether they wanted to go there or not. So that package does not set someone up for success. It sets someone up for failure. We have to do a better job than to have 1/3 of the people being released from prison back in prison in 3 years. That doesn't count the people who go back to prison in 4 years, or the people who end up in local jails, or end up homeless or addicted. We have to do more to make sure that the people who have been to prison are better than when they started off. The Department of Corrections needs to actually correct people and set them on a path for success. We want them to ultimately become taxpayers. That should be our goal, and there's a lot of work to do. So we've explored the history of mass incarceration in this country and how Washington State stacks up against the rest of the country. In fact, we rank only 41st out of the 50 states in the use of incarceration. We make pretty good decisions about who should go to prison. And the good news for all of us is that public safety in Washington State is as good as it's been in the last 60 years. But the bad news is our prisons are full, 100% full. And if we don't plan to build a new one, we better plan to keep people from coming back to prison.
Okay, that's all I've got. Certainly hope the videos help. See you in class.